Hey folks, welcome to another episode of Leader Talk. I'm SEAC retired John Wayne Troxell, your host, and today we have a very special guest on today, and we're going to talk about a very sensitive subject and a very critical incident that happened in 2017. My guest today is a mother of two boys. She's a Gold Star wife, and she's the author of the award-winning book Sacrifice: The Green Berets, A Fateful Ambush, and a Gold Star widow's fight for the truth. She's the first woman in her family to graduate from high school. She attended California Polytechnic State University, graduating with a degree in environmental sciences and horticulture. She has a passion for writing, and the writing comes out in the book here. She's been published in newspapers and magazines, including New York Times, The Daily Beast, AARP, The Daily Wire, and Task and Purpose. And she's a fellow PNWer like me right now. She lives in the Washington State. Ladies and gentlemen, help me welcoming in Michelle Black. Michelle, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much, John. I'm excited to be here.
We're here to talk about your book, but more importantly, we want to talk about you as a Gold Star spouse, your husband, Staff Sergeant Bryan Black, Green Beret, who was killed in action during the events in Niger. We want to talk about that today too. And then we kind of want to talk about some of the lessons learned in your journey, as you describe in the book, in fighting for the truth. Let's start off talking about you and Bryan. How did you and Bryan initially meet?
I took some time off after college and thought I'd go up to Mammoth Lakes in California. It's a big ski area. And I started teaching snowboarding just kind of for fun. And Brian took some time off after college and showed up to basically ski, and he played online poker for a living to support himself. So I was at church one night and he shows up. And honestly, I thought he was crazy. Brian was 6'2". At the time, he was doing cage fighting, MMA, and right before he moved down there, so he was his neck was just thick, and he looked like he should have two black eyes. I mean, he clearly was a fighter. And I just thought, who is this person? He doesn't fit here. He had tight sweater on, we're all in our baggy, cool snowboard kid clothes. But yeah, we spent a lot of time skiing together. And then eventually we started doing a lot of backpacking in the summer. And then he just kind of sprung it on me one day that we were basically dating. So he's going to call me his girlfriend. And after a little discussion, we decided that that was a good idea. That's kind of the history of that. We were engaged within a few months and yeah, married the next summer.
So, Bryan made a decision to join the Army. I think at the time, your oldest son, Ezekiel, was already born at that time.
Yeah, we'd actually just had our second son, Isaac. Ezekiel would have been 3 and Isaac would have been 1. It was 2009 and there was the Great Recession and there was just an issue with jobs. And because Brian had been playing online poker, there just nobody would hire him in an actual job because he had no experience with his degree. And no one could get a job anywhere. So, and then of course they were tightening up the restrictions on online gambling. So pretty much all of the poker sites were going out of business. So he lost his job. He actually worked for one of the poker sites, one of the big ones. So we were kind of stuck. And Brian goes, "Well, I always wanted to be a Navy SEAL. What do you think?" And I was like, "I don't care. I've got 2 kids. They're going crazy. We could use not life insurance, health insurance. So if that gets us health insurance and it gets you busy working, then do it." Because Brian could not sit still. He was someone who had to be going all the time.
So I know he joined the military to be a medic initially, and
He
then
did.
pursued special forces.
Yes, so he looked at the SEALs, looked all over, and then he decided to join the Army. He did initially go in as a 68 whiskey, trained out of, I believe he was in Texas. Once he graduated, we went to Colorado Springs, and we were in Colorado Springs for a few months, maybe a year, when he just went, "I'm done, I'm bored." And he was older when he joined. He was 28. He was already starting to like, well, let's try and start a business at home together. And I'm going, I've got 2 babies, they're nuts. I've got one that's on the autism spectrum, so I was busy and he's wanting me to help him start a business. And he started it and I just went, "What else will keep you busy?" And he goes, "Well, I always wanted to do special forces." And I'm like, "Do that, just do that." So he started training to go to SFAS, special forces assessment and selection. I think at the time it was a 6-week course, if I remember right. I know I
Yeah.
read it down in my book, but my memory now is shot after 7 years. I don't remember what it was, but I believe it was 6 weeks. And so at that time, you leave and they take his phone and he's just gone. So I knew if I heard from him in 6 weeks, he'd be selected. And of course, 6 weeks later, I get the call I'm in, which with Brian was never a surprise. He's one of those people who would rather die than quit anything. So unless he got injured, I knew he'd be selected. And a lot of it too is mental psychological tests and intelligence tests. And Brian was a chess player growing up. Like, he won second in the nation when he was just 12 years old. So he was brilliant, and I knew as far as that went, we wouldn't have an issue. But it was more just, are you going to get an injury? So
When you think of kind of the pedigree for a Green Beret, somebody like Brian, a mixed martial artist, a fighter, so he has that physical toughness, but then the intellect and the mental acuity from being a world class chess player to online poker professional. I mean, these are the kind of attributes that a special operations unit is like, man, I want that guy on my team.
interesting learning that whole part. I never knew. I just thought, okay, this is like the SEALs and the Green Berets, and you know what I mean. And I know the ongoing joke once he became a Green Beret was, that the SEALs they pick because they're tough, the Green Berets they pick because they're tough and smart. It had to do with like intelligence levels. And I just was like, okay. But that was what I found in the majority of his friends and in the people we'd run into who were Green Berets. They were smart. Even, the ones who joked about them being the dumbest guy in the team, they were all these brilliant guys.
So you all get assigned to Fort Bragg, North Carolina at the time, 3rd Special Forces Group. And prior to the 2017 deployment, Brian had been to combat in Afghanistan. Plus, he also had a previous deployment to Niger, right?
Yes. So once he graduated the Q course, and I believe he graduated April 2015, they instantly sent him to work, I believe, either with a B or a C team in Afghanistan, just at the end of their deployment, kind of just as support.
Yeah.
And then he came back that year, I believe it was in October. And then they, just for the holidays started, and then they instantly sent him to Ranger School. He went to Ranger School January through April, and he graduated April 1st, and then was assigned to ODA through 3212, 3212. And then they immediately deployed May 15th, 2016, to Maradi, Niger, which is kind of a southeastern part of Niger. And then
Yeah.
they came back October 31st of 2016 and began to prepare for their next deployment, of course, because that's just the way it is. It was a 6-month schedule, 6 on, 6 off, but really 3 months of training during that 6 months off, from languages to, as you probably know, they would train within the group. So Brian would teach everybody on the team, hey, here's how we do in the field blood transfusions and this and that. So he would train the whole team on different things. And the different guys, here's how we build a radio, or here's how we, so they each kind of train on their specialty, everybody on the team. So if one of them is injured in battle, the other guy can kind of take over that guy's job temporarily. That's how I
Yeah.
understood it. And then they deployed again August 26th, I believe, 2017.
You write in the book about the day that Brian left and you dropped him off at Fayetteville Regional Airport. This is the deployment where the ambush happened and Brian was killed in action. You mentioned you had a feeling of uneasiness and you sensed that Brian had a feeling of uneasiness too. Can you kind of describe why you think it was that way?
Yeah. And I don't know why. I was never someone to have that anxiety. And I think Brian and I were just always more like, hey, we'll see you when we see you, or I'll talk to you as soon as I can. And I mean, the first deployment, I didn't hear from him for 4 weeks, 5 weeks. And I just didn't think anything of it, never worried. And I just never worried about him. I had the kids to worry about and everything else. And I just assumed everything would be fine. But something, it just was a gut feeling or a premonition. And I think, you know, we all get those sometimes. We don't know what's off, but we know something's off. And I remember thinking, I need to stop him, but there's no way I can. I knew we both felt it, but neither of us ever talk about those things because you just can't. And it's like actually hugged longer. Normally it's just a quick hug, quick peck, see you later. And that time was entirely different. And he did the reassuring, like, you know, I'll be back soon, which we never did. And that's when I knew, like, I just don't feel right. And I don't think he does either. And if we're both
Yeah.
feeling this is not okay. And from the day he left, we had this kitchen window that looked out over our front yard. And I kept looking out it every day when I was going about my tasks. Every time I walked in the kitchen, I would look out the window and look for uniforms walking across my lawn because I knew someone was coming for me.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we're going to take a quick break right here and hear from our sponsors. When we come back, I'd like to get into the events of October 2nd to the 4th and kind of talk about that a little bit. So let's take a quick break. Let's hear from our sponsors.
Downrange Supplements. As the brand of the troops, we produce only the highest quality supplements conducive to mission effectiveness. Whether it's our fully dosed pre-workout, recovery and rehydration, or Mermite protein, it's time to continually improve your fighting position with Downrange Supplements. Go to www.downrangesups.com today and take your training to the next level.
Hey folks, welcome back to Leader Talk. I'm SEAC retired John Wayne Troxell. Our special guest is Michelle Black, Gold Star spouse. Her husband was a Green Beret, Staff Sergeant Bryan Black, killed in action during the ambush in Niger in October of 2017. And she is also a published author of her book, Sacrifice. I'm here to tell you folks, if you want a riveting book that will have you on the edge of your seat and not able to put the book down, you got to get this book and read it. And if you are affiliated with the military, you're a military spouse, you're a service member or whatever, this is the real deal right here. Well, Michelle, welcome back to segment 2. We want to get into the events of October 2nd through the 4th, 2017, the ambush. What is your understanding of what the initial mission was there and how it morphed into these, as you described, these 3 different concepts that got progressively more dangerous and caused the risk to go up on 3212 and Bryan's team?
So from what I could gather, you know, and there's 2 different versions, right? Depending on the timeline you're reading in my story. So timeline 1, it was just a routine mission, all of it. But what I learned later was that the team was called on the night of October, I believe, 1st, and told, hey, we want you to go down. Oh, no, that was the night of October 2nd. And we want you to go to the town of Tillowa. They had received intel that there was basically an HVT, high value target named Damdu Shefu, who was affiliated with ISIS. And they said that he was in the market, you know, in the city shopping. Now, the way it actually works is he would be somewhere nearby and he'd be surrounded by, you know, all sorts of whatever other ISIS members protecting him, and he'd send his guys into the town. But supposedly they were there. There was intelligence, single source intelligence, and it was SIGINT, so signals intelligence. So basically a cell phone pinged somewhere down there saying that he was there. So they wanted the team to go up there. It was north, and they would be up there a short time, but it was more to check in. There was a military like outpost there for the local Nigerians. So check with the military and just kind of have a conversation and then do a civilian reconnaissance, see if anybody had seen him, collect intelligence, and essentially comfort the people there, like, hey, we're here, don't worry, you know, we've got your backs, essentially. And so that was kind of the whole goal. They're going to go up there that night, collect intelligence, comfort people, head back. No big deal.
That mission got accomplished, right?
Well, they ended up canceling it for that night and then calling them and saying, we actually want you to do it in the morning. And
Okay.
by then the team's like, well, this is kind of silly because by the time we go down there, it's well outside the window. He is gone. Like most of the information's not going to matter. And, but we'll go down there. We'll see what we can find. So essentially, they head out there super early in the morning. They get there, they send their partner force in because that's how these things work. They were there on a training mission. Essentially, they're there just to train the local Nigerians. So they have the local Nigerians go in, talk to everybody in the village, try to collect intelligence. They come out, hey, no one's here. They haven't seen anything. Okay, good. Then they go, to the military base. They talk to everybody at the military installation, do a meeting there with local leaders. Everything's good, checks out, and they leave. So they're on their way home. They're halfway back to their base in Wall of Niger, and they are told to pull to the side of the road. And by then, they're only about 2 hours from home. Now, you've got to consider the fact that they only packed for a one-day mission. They don't have ammunition. They have a little, but not very much because they don't plan on running into any trouble. And they wouldn't. They do this kind of routine patrol all the time. They also only have enough food, water, everything for a day. And you got to figure they're in sub-Saharan Africa. So they get a call, hey, we want you to pull over, turn back around, and head north towards the Mali border. We believe there's a campsite for this same terrorist up near the Mali border. So now we're talking about going past Tilawa. And Tilawa, just outside the village, all roads end. So now you're talking about driving basically on rabbit trails through the desert in vehicles that aren't built for off-roading. One of the biggest issues in Niger is vehicle rollovers, and that's where the majority of American service members are killed, are in vehicle accidents. So they're wanting them to turn around and just drive through the middle of the desert at night, chasing a terrorist, essentially. So that was the second con op is, hey, what do you think? And the guys on the team say this isn't going to work because when we get up there and it's going to take us so long. We don't have any of the weaponry, we don't have the food. And if there's anything that goes wrong up there, because it's a very dangerous area, it's known as the Wild West, that's a free fire zone, which means that essentially if you see a terrorist or anybody on a motorcycle out there, you assume they're a terrorist and you can freely open fire on them because you want to basically put down the threat before they attack you. So it's not a safe area. Nobody really lives up there besides a handful of farmers and a ton of terrorists. So the team says, this is not safe. We cannot do this. We would like to bring in a helicopter unit called Team Arlet. Then we have built-in casualty evacuation. If anything goes wrong, they can come in from the north and basically block anybody from running from the camp and from attacking us. So this is kind of the thought, like the only way that this is doable is with the heliborne unit. So
Can I ask a question right quick, Michelle? So the ODA commander initially pushed back to the higher headquarters, right? Saying that this is
yeah,
too risky of a mission. But through his own initiative, did he do this coordination with Arlet? This coordination didn't come from higher headquarters. He did this unilaterally on his own, right?
he did because he pushed back and he realized that they would have no choice. Everybody on the team and their partner force leadership said, this is dangerous. This is not doable. But those higher up the chain would not listen. So the battalion commander and the group commander both just said, we don't care. You're not making your own missions. You're going. So essentially, their hands were tied. And so Captain Perazini, the captain of the team, called his friend who was the captain of Team Arlet and just said, hey, this is what we're doing. Would you guys like to get on board? Basically, you're the only way we're going to be able to make this mission a success. So they began to coordinate. And then the Team Arlet captain reached out to higher headquarters and said, we'd like to get on this mission. So that's how those two, that part was formed.
Okay. And so then initially the mission is set up, the CONOP is approved, and they're going to execute the mission. And what happens next?
They're told, hey, we're going to start. So from higher headquarters, they're told we still have, a bunch of video teleconferences and things to do all the paperwork and get everything finalized before Team Arlet can take off. But you guys have essentially a 10 to 12-hour drive ahead of you because the movement's going to take a long time. They've got a large convoy of 8 people. So they turn around, they start heading north, and eventually they run out of trails and they are driving in the dark using NVGs, so night vision goggles, and they are essentially Captain Perzini has to get out and walk in front of the trucks to guide them because they can't have their lights on. They don't want to be detected. Ironically, driving through the desert with an 8 vehicle convoy, there's really no way to go undetected, but they're trying. And he also doesn't want them to go off a cliff or even just an embankment and roll a vehicle. So it takes them a little bit longer than expected. They arrive almost at midnight, and by then they're supposed to be up to kind of a meeting site. And that's when they get to their initial point and they hear over the radio that Team Arlet has run into a windstorm and has been forced to turn around. So now their backup, Team Arlet was going to be the lead. So now their lead team has been canceled. So Captain Perazini says we request to return to base. They put that in, and essentially they're told, no, you are now not only you're the only team, but you are now the lead team and you will do this mission. And I would later learn that there was no second threat assessment run on whether or not they, could now do this mission without a helibarn unit, without built-in CASVAC. And, essentially they had no quick reaction force aiding them. So they had nothing. They were out there alone on the edge of the Mali Niger border, which is very dangerous, and just told to figure it out.
Wow. And then they go in, they allow the Nigerian forces to go in and clear the camp. And I think they find a motorcycle there and they burn the motorcycle and everything. But everything starts going bad on their return trip out, right?
Yeah. Well, and one thing of note that of course nobody told us, and until I did the research, I didn't find out until I interviewed Captain Perazini, but when they were clearing the campsite, hidden underneath, because these trees had big canopies that went all the way to the ground, there was two men. There were two men with a motorcycle, and they pushed it out, two terrorists, and they jumped on it and rode it off into the desert. And the only air support they had was an ISR overhead, and it was running out of fuel. They shared it with multiple teams on the continent. So they were going to have to send it back anyway. So Mike ordered it to follow the motorcycle, and the motorcycle, they would find out, met up with multiple other motorcycles in the middle of the desert, and then they all went separate ways. And that's probably where it all started.
And that's probably
So
when
yeah, and
the enemy force started marshaling after that, I would assume.
yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So
So
talk about on their way out, they stopped at the village of Tongo Tongo, if I remember right. And
yes.
yeah, and your thoughts there as they were doing the key leader engagement, and then it seemed as you talked to some of the team members, it seemed like the village chief was wanting them to hang around.
Yeah, so because as we discussed earlier, they don't have enough food and water, and basically the partner force has completely run out. So they're forced to stop by Tongo Tongo just to get them some water. And while they stop in Tongo Tongo, village chief and several other elders come running out, and there's kind of a confrontation initially. The village chief is pointing at Mike and saying, you guys don't come here. You leave us on the edge of the desert, very accusatory. And then they calm down and, he says, well, we're happy to have you here. Well, essentially, he starts stalling. Mike says, well, we said we'd be here 30 minutes. I'm glad we worked this out. We're going to go. And the village chief basically then says, well, we've got an injured kid. And they bring out an injured kid and he has some sort of spinal issue. Brian checks him out and they say he's good to go. And so once they take the kid back, it's, well, we can slaughter a goat and let's have lunch together. And so this just keeps going on, and right away Mike's getting concerned and says, okay, we need to go. We're past our 30 minutes. We are leaving. So Captain Perazini says, no, we're not staying for lunch. We're going to pack up and leave now. We've already overstayed our time slot. And so he planned on being there no more than 30 minutes. And now they were looking at 35, 40 minutes. So he says, we're out. And essentially they get in the trucks with the village chief protesting trying to get them to stay. The minute they left and cleared the village, shots began to ring out. And that's when he realized, okay, this is what's going on. And that's kind of right when the ambush started. Although I would say, I know we call it an ambush. I've always said it was less of an ambush and more of them trying to set up an ambush. And so as they drove out there, all of the fighters that planned on being there were still incoming.
When the fire started, they were doing exactly what they should be doing, which is continuing to move. And then all of a sudden, the two lead Niger vehicles with Niger forces stopped. And I think there was a bit of a fender bender there or something. Can you kind of describe what happened there?
Yeah, so the two Nigerian partner forces were in the lead and they panicked. There had been several ambushes of local forces, never Americans, in the region quite a bit lately. And so when they heard the shots ringing out, realized they were under attack, I think they just full on panicked, threw their trucks in reverse. And the first one ran into the front of the American vehicle, and the next one tried to avoid both vehicles and pulled around it, but then clipped the American vehicle and came to a stop on the driver's side door. So that basically boxed everybody in.
Yeah, and that forced an unscheduled halt. Then Captain Perazini decides to grab some Nigerian troops and go and try to flank the enemy force to potentially eliminate them, because at this time they didn't think, based off the intelligence, that the enemy force was as big as it was, right?
Correct. They, and at that point, the full force wasn't there. So at that point, they've got just a few people taking shots at them. They thought, okay, here's a couple guys from the village or a couple of ISIS guys who are hoping to get lucky. And so they're hoping to shoot a couple of us and run off and say they killed Americans. So he thinks, okay, we'll go out, we'll put them down and kind of gather some intel, grab whatever they've got on them that looks usable, or important. And then we'll take off, and this will give these guys some training. And this will give everybody back at the trucks a minute to kind of sort everything out. So they run out there, and when Mike gets over there, he realizes the more people he puts down, there's two or three more popping up in his place. And so he looks around and he sees a horde of people coming, and they begin to move in a flanking maneuver to try and outflank the team on the road. And that's when he realizes the situation they're in, and he orders the partner force to follow him, and they run back to the team, which are now under overwhelming fire.
Yeah, and from small arms fire, from large machine gun fire. At one point, I think the enemy even had some 14.5 millimeter Soviet era weapons and everything. And in your book and in the report, it outlines the absolute heroism of 3212 with their partner force. And unfortunately, your husband Brian, Dustin Wright, LaDavid Johnson, and Jeremiah Johnson were killed in action. And subsequently, the remaining members of the team, with some members of the Nigerian force, made it to a far wood line and eventually were rescued. In the official investigation that was briefed to you, what stood out to you, and what motivated you based off of that to do your own internal investigation?
There were a lot of things. One of the first things that I would say, it was a buildup over several months, and it started with the media saying, according to anonymous sources within the investigation, this was a team of cowboys that went rogue. Anybody who knows Green Berets know that they do not go rogue. So to call any single Green Beret a cowboy who went rogue, that's one thing. I mean, those ones, there are individuals who slip through the cracks that are there to be tough and cool. That's the minority. That's the 1%. The majority of Green Berets, they're extremely professional. And so when I heard that, I thought, okay, this is because the media doesn't know what they're talking about. They don't understand the difference between a red beret, a green beret, a new 18-year-old Army guy, and someone who's, by this time, Brian's 35 and highly trained. So they clearly don't know the difference. They don't know the difference between $1 million of training, right? So I thought this will be good. That's fine as long as we get the investigation. There were a few things that finally made me say, okay, I'm doing this myself. It was getting into the briefing for the investigation and having them tell me this team was a bunch of cowboys who went rogue. Not your husband, of course. He is a hero. And to me, a whole
Yeah.
team that goes rogue and acts like cowboys, there aren't heroes in that team. Then I began asking them about the con ops, and basically it's trust us, Miss Black. You'll understand when it's all said and done. And don't worry, we'll make sure to punish Mike Perazini. And I knew these men, they were friends of my husband's, and he trusted them. And I knew that I was being lied to. And when my father-in-law asked about a second threat assessment being done, a lawyer in the room stood up and said, basically shushed everyone and said, yes, we ran a second threat assessment, which was a lie. And later, when there was a press briefing, like the following week, I believe it was, the head of AFRICOM got up and stated that while all teams on the continent were performing optimally, this team is not indicative of what special operators do. So in one fell swoop, the leader of AFRICOM and all the Green Berets operating on the continent completely dishonored my husband and all of those who fought and died alongside him. And that's when I realized this is bigger than me. This is bigger than Brian. You don't get to destroy men to cover up your incompetence, and you don't get to lie to families of the fallen and just use it as an excuse of, well, we gave them awards and told them they were brave. That doesn't work for me.
Yeah. So you set out on a mission to do your own interview of the surviving team members, those that were there, not just 3212, but people that were 3212 was near and dear, those that were in Niamey and other places like that. You did a thorough job. And I mentioned this to you earlier, you being a military spouse, as comprehensive as you describe the battle in your book, I feel like I am standing behind that truck with Brian and Dustin Wright and Jeremiah Johnson. I feel like I am running alongside LaDavid Johnson as he is being pursued by dozens of enemy fighters. I feel like I'm on the edge of that wood line where the ODA decided they were going to make their last stand, and they all thought this was it, but we're going to take as many as the MFers with us and everything. Did you run into any difficulties? Not from the team members, because I know the relationship you had. It was a family type relationship with those members. But did you have any difficulties? Did anybody try to shut doors in your face as you were pursuing the truth?
I think absolutely nobody believed I could pull anything like this off. So most people just thought I was, the Army term dependa, and I was dreaming. And I thought, well, it's good. They think I'm just a dumb blonde because that works for me. But most of the people I talked with and interviewed did believe in me, which that was the one thing that I needed, was for them to believe. And everybody I interviewed was more than willing if you need anything else. So I had an open door policy with everybody on the team and other officers where I could call them and say, hey, I need to talk to this person. And if they're not willing to talk to me, will you ask them these questions for me, just so I get a feel for what's going on back at the base? And if they don't want their name mentioned, that's fine. We'll just label them as Officer so-and-so. So I did a lot of, name covering and all of that, just because the number one goal was to protect everybody. And the goal of the book was to save careers, not end them. And at that point, the only reason I was able to get the men initially to work with me was because of the fact that their careers were being threatened by those who were supposed to be protecting them. And they realized they had nothing left to lose.
Okay, we're going to take another break here, but before we take a break, I talk all the time, even I'm retired now, about what it means to serve and that when our service members, our men and women go to combat, that families back home are always concerned about their safety and everything, and no one, and you described it up front looking out your window, when those military sedans pull up and the chaplains get out and the notification officers get out. When on there, I think Brian was killed on the 4th of October. This was Con-Op 3 when they were, and then they ended up in the ambush on the 4th of October. When did you get notified, and how did that go down?
I got notified that night. Unfortunately, there was media on the continent and they were reporting on it within hours of the ambush. So I already knew deep down by 8 o'clock that night that Brian's team had been attacked. I knew that without a doubt, but I knew that he was dead. I just felt it. So they knocked on my door, I'd say sometime between 9 and 10 o'clock that night. I think it was close to about 9:30. And that was hard. My kids were asleep, so that was good.
Yeah, you describe it in deep detail in here. And again, this was, as I mentioned to you, I went through every gamut of emotion reading your book because, I spent 38 years in uniform, 5 years in combat. My wife and I have been associated with losing service members on the battlefield, attending memorial services, all this stuff. And all the things you described there was so vivid that I was emotional reading it there and everything. So anyways, we're going to take a break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about some of the things that could have potentially been avoided at the operational strategic level that wouldn't have put ODA 3212 in the situation they were in. So let's take a quick break and we'll hear from our sponsors. Hey folks, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Leader Talk. I want to take a quick moment to talk about leadership. At PME Hard Consulting and Lead, we offer top-tier leadership development and coaching. With over 60 years of combined military and leadership experience to lean on, along with certifications in the Power of Positive Leadership, Power of Positive Teams, and the Energy Bus programs by best-selling author John Gordon, we offer training that will help you cultivate positive, impactful leadership within your organization. To learn more or to schedule your leadership workshop, head to www.pmehard.com and start building a better, more effective leadership team today. Hey folks, welcome back to Leader Talk. This is our final segment here. I'm John Wayne Troxell, retired SEAC. My special guest today, Michelle Black. We are talking about her book, Sacrifice. Michelle is the spouse of a Green Beret that was killed in action. She's a Gold Star spouse. And she talks about this riveting story of what happened to ODA 3212 during the ambush in Niger. Michelle, one of the things, serving as a SEAC and being the senior enlisted guy and reporting straight to the chairman and the Secretary of Defense, one of the things I always focused on up there was not forgetting where I came from and understand that when we ask people to do things at the tactical level, especially in dangerous places in combat, that if it doesn't make complete sense up here, then we shouldn't expect them to execute it when we haven't mitigated the risk. One of the things I use all the time is when we don't mitigate the risk and we ask a mission that is full of risk, the captain and the master sergeant on the ground incur all of that risk and the team. And so what happened on the 2nd to the 4th of October 2017 to your husband and to ODA 3212 is a textbook example of what I just described. 3 different con-ups that we already talked about that got progressively more dangerous. None of the risk was mitigated. And in the end, the risk fell down to Captain Parazzini, Master Sergeant Smith, your husband, and the other team members there. One question I have for you in your research, it seems to me that, and you mentioned a second intelligence estimate did not come out. It seems to me that higher headquarters was chasing a sole source intel. You mentioned SIGINT. Is that what you found out in your research, that it was one sole source of signals intelligence that the higher headquarters was following and asking 3212 to get after?
Yes, that's why from even the first night, Captain Perezzini pushed back a little bit on the initial mission, and then he continued to push back, but especially when they were heading north to the campsite the second day, because once they were getting to the second and third con-op, but the mission was getting progressively more dangerous, he basically just said, listen, we're going off a single source SIGINT, the same single source SIGINT, which means the same essentially cell phone ping. I mean, that's not how he
Yeah.
put it, but in my research, that's kind of what I concluded. And he just said, we're building a pattern that gets us into this rut that makes us predictable. And they're going to be expecting us if every time they turn their cell phone on, we show up. And so that was the big concern all across the board.
Yeah, and then we've already been talking about fighter management. You mentioned the team prepared for that one mission in terms of armament and their supplies and everything, water and food and everything, and ammunition and stuff like that. And the Nigerians as well, who don't get resupplied as well as obviously U.S. forces. And so here again, the mission, the first con-op is accomplished, but they're asked to do another con-op and then another con-op. But there was no thought in there from the higher headquarters on, one, how much sleep have these guys gotten? What is the weather, the oppressive heat and humidity doing? How much water do they have? How much food do they have? Was there anywhere in your research that you saw that the higher headquarters were even taking this into consideration as they continued to say, hey, go do these progressively dangerous missions?
No, not at all, not whatsoever. In fact, it's interesting because even with Kazovac, I remember my husband before he left telling me, they're saying that it's a 4 to 6 hour casualty evacuation. And because Brian was the lead medic, he turned in a report to higher headquarters and said, we're looking more at 6 to 8, maybe even 8 to 10, which he said that's a huge problem. And for just context, in Afghanistan, the estimate was around an hour max. So we're talking about someone gets a wound that they can survive easily from. And when you're talking 8 hours, you're talking they've bled out and it's too late. So it was a huge issue that was never addressed. And I think a lot of my research showed me just exactly that, is that there were a lot of issues that were pushed higher up the chain over the years that were entirely ignored by AFRICOM, whether it was trucks, whether it was casualty evacuation times, anything. And so even the response time when they said, hey, we're under fire, no one's coming. No one's going to get there in time. It doesn't matter if the fight goes on for 2 or 3 hours. So their lack of supplies was a huge issue when they're going to run out of ammunition within 30 minutes to an hour.
Yeah. And you talked about the golden hour of medevac that certainly was way out of whack there, which meant any kind of personnel recovery assets to come in and rescue and get American bodies or whatever out of there was way outside that window as well. And their ability to get any kind of close air support or anything like that. Obviously, once I think it was Brent called the Broken Arrow, all of a sudden French Mirage fighters started showing up and some other partner force helicopters started showing up and everything. But was there no thought in those kind of things, whether it was joint fires or, that included attack aviation, close air support or anything like that from the higher headquarters to kind of mitigate the risk?
No, not there. There didn't seem to be any risk mitigation forethought. Once they were under fire, then all of a sudden everybody's scrambling. But you've got to figure that the ISR that came overhead, that was the first thing to show up during the ambush. And they were relaying messages between someone who was actually basically driving the thing with a joystick in the US, right? Or that's how I understand it. So the communication was being fed to somebody in the US. I believe it was either Idaho or Ohio. So they've got a guy there in the United States who's receiving all the communication from the guys on the ground in Africa, and then he's communicating with the base, and then the base is coming back to him, and then he's sending the message back to the guys on the ground. So this is a very long, drawn out communication process that leaves these guys on the ground for hours and hours waiting for rescue, even after the fast movers come over. So it was a mess and there was no forethought.
You know, we talk all the time about how do we prevent things like this from happening again. And unfortunately, and you've kind of talked about this, you know, we saw this in the withdrawal from Afghanistan and in other operations, you know, the disciplinary action that comes down. So we create all of these conditions from the higher headquarters and certainly at the strategic level, and we don't mitigate any of the risk. And then when something bad goes down, like this right here, all of a sudden, all of those leaders in that chain start looking at the people on the ground, in this case, 3212, to say, well, what did they do wrong? Well, let's talk about what we did to put them in a situation that they were not going to be able to accomplish the mission. They came up against a force of 100 militants that were heavily armed. They fought their asses off. And now we're going to look internally to them instead of looking at the processes. And you kind of described that based off of why you did your own investigation. So can you kind of talk about, you know, in your investigation and talking with the team, you know, and stuff like that, and what disciplinary action was held on the team?
Yeah. So, it was interesting because from the beginning, it was like the officers just, it's all the team. They're a bunch of cowboys. And I remember a lot of people bought this, it's when you're in the middle of loss, and it's easy to put blame on those that you can see, right? And there's video of the ambush. So it's like, oh, what are they doing? What are they doing wrong? And you can see all the mistakes, but are they really mistakes? You don't know what happened before then. You don't know what happens after, and you don't know, what circumstances brought them there. But they're the easy ones to blame. A lot of the officers, what I found was because they did. I mean, they started issuing basically letters of reprimand, putting them in the or the permanent files of these guys. And they were rescinded, not all of them, but it was everybody lower down the chain. And a lot of them, for instance, Major Alan Van Zandt, he was actually supposed to be at the base, the AOB, Advanced Operations Base in Niamey, kind of leading all of these things. But he was on paternity leave when the ambush occurred. He'd been gone for about, I think, 5 to 7 days at that point. So he was nowhere near this, didn't even know about the operation, didn't approve anything, and yet he lost his career over it because he was a very convenient person to blame. But there was absolutely no way he could have known about the mission or held any responsibility for the mission. And they blamed it on training that he supposedly had the team do, but he was not actually the one in charge when the training was done, and he did not sign off on the training. Again, it was the same battalion commander who was in charge of that training and had had it approved by, of course, the group commander. So they were all the ones who'd come up with the training, assigned the training, basically were completely in charge of signing off on all the training that the guys did. But it was Alan Van Zandt, who had nothing to do with any of it and was not there for any of it, that lost his career over it. And his letter of reprimand was not rescinded. And then, of course, a lot of us didn't know this until later. And then in the middle of it were, Captain Perazini and a couple other guys. And Captain Perazini did lose his, he didn't lose his career. The team sergeant did. So, some of the guys got their letters rescinded, others didn't. So it was a mess. And as far as the officers go, what I found was it was ironic because the whole briefing, the whole investigation was about lessons learned. Right, and how do we not repeat this? And from the beginning, I know me, my father-in-law, my and Brian's mom, like, so all of us would sit around and talk about it, and we didn't want anyone punished. Like, even once we knew who was responsible, we never wanted anyone punished. What we wanted was for them to just say what actually happened and say, this, I own some of this, and I'm going to make sure it's not going to happen again. But the fact that they couldn't say, I'm responsible for some of this and I'm going to make sure it doesn't happen again made me think they do need to lose their careers because they're going to be in charge of somebody else and they're going to make these same mistakes again. And it's going to be more about their career, advancing their careers, and sending these guys out to do dangerous missions that will help them earn another star and possibly get men killed than it will be about these men's lives. And that's the problem.
Yeah. So no one from battalion or above was held accountable for any of this.
Not at all. Eventually, so a couple years later, Congress actually held the group commander accountable, and he lost his career. But
Yeah.
that took quite a few years and an act of Congress. So,
Wow. Unbelievable. So, Michelle, through all of this, through the loss of your husband, everything you've done to try to make this right, what have you learned through all of this process? Because I will tell you, you have been a treasure for all of this and how to right wrongs and everything. What's the key things that you've learned through all of this?
quite a, I mean, I think there, gosh, there's so many things. One thing is you have to trust your gut no matter what. I mean, from knowing that that was the last time I was going to see Brian to telling my kids, knowing the exact right way to tell them, to everyone who told me I'm not capable of writing a book, including a few journalists, and just going with my gut no matter what. I'd say that's always been the right way to go. So I've definitely learned to always trust my gut. And I think the other thing is that most people are on your side. I know when Brian died and when I was battling to write the book and get the book out and promote it, my head was so in it that I felt like I was battling the world and no one was on my side. But, now 7 years in, I step back and I look around and I realize that that wasn't it. I wasn't fighting alone. And the vast majority, 99% of the people I came across were on my side. They were fighting with me and for me and cheering me on. And yeah, there's always going to be a few people who, for some reason want you to fail or they're horrible. I don't know. But, most people are out there cheering you on.
Yeah. And what advice would you give to a military spouse, not just if their loved one is in special operations, but serving as part of this expeditionary military with all the things we have going on in the world? What advice would you give to a military spouse about how to be engaged and to serve alongside your loved one in uniform?
I know what worked for me and Brian the best was to always keep everything at home as stable as possible and try not to, because he had enough on his plate and so much stress that if I let him know we had stress back at home, it affected his job performance. And so if he called, I'd lie, oh, we're doing good. Nothing's wrong with the kids. Here's some funny stories. I'll send you a picture that Zeke drew that was, borderline inappropriate. Just the fun stuff. Because if I handed him problems he could not solve from half a world away, it just added more stress to his life and he didn't need to know about it. And the other piece of advice I always give everybody in the military because you never need it until you need it. And when you need it, it is a nightmare if you don't have it. And that is a will and a plan. And we had it, and it was just by default. One of Brian's, I think, heads of his unit when he was a 68 Whiskey in Colorado Springs made him put together a will and instructions for when he died. And so when he died, I knew he wanted to be buried at Arlington. I knew which songs he wanted played, which most were inappropriate and got vetoed. But, we knew. So that helped. There was no question where the money was going, what his intentions were, what he wanted, because in the end, you care so much more than you expect about what he wanted in his death.
Well, Michelle, we're out of time. I wish I could sit here and talk to you all day. We didn't get into the intricate detail of the firefight there, but I want to leave that for our viewers so that they can go and get your book and read it. I will tell you, to our audience, like I said before, it's one of the most riveting books I've ever written, and I've gone through the gamut of emotions. So, Michelle, how can people follow you or reach out to you if they want to?
So I'm on Instagram at Michelle Black 71 and Facebook at author Michelle Black. Or I'm on Twitter, but not very often, but Michelle Black 71 there too. So, and if you want to grab a copy of my book, you can always just go to Amazon. I've got an Audible version if you're more of a listener, and hardback and paperback. So yeah,
Awesome.
or anywhere books are sold.
Sure, absolutely. So we always end Leader Talk with a warrior shout out. And I'd like to give that to you and allow you to give a warrior shout out to whoever you'd like to.
So, I think for me, it's hard to pick one. If I could do a warrior shout out, I hope it could be for a few people. And it would be
Absolutely.
all the men that my husband, Brian, Jeremiah, LaDavid, and Dustin all gave their lives for. And that's for his team members. Yeah. So
So,
those are the true heroes.
absolutely, 100%. Well, Michelle, thank you so much for being on Leader Talk today. It's a true honor to spend time with you today. As I said before, you're a true treasure. Keep doing what you're doing. You inspire so many people. And the first time I met you at MCon in 2023, I was so inspired by you at that point. And so I knew at some point I wanted to get you on the show. So I greatly appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much for having me, John. That was a huge inspiration for me meeting you at MCon. So this is so much fun for me to get to be a part of your show.
All right. Thanks a lot. And to our audience, thank you so much. If you like what you see here on Leader Talk, please give us a follow on YouTube or Spotify. And I'm an author myself. You can pick up my book, Surrender or Die, Reflections of a Combat Leader, on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or at pmehard.com. So thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on Leader Talk. Boom.